Wings, inspired by the song Angel in Manhattan by Ellis Paul. For Lucy, written by Richard Hendry. Copyright 2018. Wings, Tuesday, 8 a.m. A narrow pillar of sunlight from the break in the curtains stretched across Jenny's bed and onto her face. Still half asleep, she closed her eyes tighter, not wanting to get up on this cold morning. Her small body bundled under two blankets and curled into a ball, and still she could not seem to get warm. The chill in the air felt cold in her nostrils as she breathed it in. She cringed as she stuck one foot out from the covers. She did not want to, but she had to pee. A moment later, she heard the front door open and her Aunt Peg's voice, talking to no one in particular, that it was so cold in the house. She rushed off the bed and down the hall to the bathroom as her Aunt Peg called out to her. "Honey," Peg called, "it's time to get up." Then Peg heard the door shut and a small voice almost singing, "I gotta pee, gotta pee." Peg managed a small smile as she took in the unbelievable mess the apartment had gotten into in the 2 days she had been absent. Most mornings, she had come over the past month and did everything she could to keep the train on the tracks, getting Jenny to preschool, cleaning the house, and trying to help Michael, her brother-in-law, as much as she could. This morning, the moment she came in the door, she knew he was not there. It made her mad that he would leave Jenny alone. He was not doing right by her, but she loved them so much, she could not bring herself to hurt them or call HRS. She also knew that Michael was not far away. He would be right where he had been for the past month, in a small cemetery 2 blocks from their building. She would find him asleep next to her sister's grave. Peg was afraid for them, afraid for Jenny, and afraid that Michael would hurt himself in some way. She did not think he would kill himself, but on a cold night like this last one, he could die simply sleeping outside. A second later, Jenny came trotting down the hall to the kitchen and ran to her with open arms. "Good morning, honey," Peg said to the girl, hugging her tight. "How did you sleep?" "I was cold, but it was okay," she replied in her little voice. Peg glanced at the thermostat. Michael had it set on the right temperature, yet it was really cold in the apartment. Peg wondered if it might be broken. "Let's get you warmed up with some breakfast," Peg offered. Jenny smiled and then added in an odd tone, "Why do angels come at night?" Peg was confused by the question. "What do you mean, honey?" she asked. "There was an angel in my room last night," the girl said flatly. Peg started to cry. She turned her head so that Jenny could not see. "They're just making sure you're okay," was all she could think of to say. "Did Mommy send them?" she asked. Now Peg was sobbing, her heart breaking all over again. She wondered what this little girl could be thinking, how she was dealing with all of this. Peg tried to keep her emotions in. "Yes, honey," was all she could get out, her body shaking, her hands trembling as she tried to flip the eggs. "What's wrong, Aunt Peg?" Jenny asked. Peg was not doing a very good job of hiding it from the girl. "Nothing, honey, I'm just too cold," she lied to her, hoping that she would believe her. Jenny let out a sigh and a small laugh. "I guess when she left, she forgot to close the window." Peg stopped cooking and turned to the little girl. A strange shout of fear raced through her. "What do you mean, honey?" she asked Jenny. Jenny turned her head and pointed towards the window in the living room, its curtains blowing in the breeze from the open window. "When we finished playing last night, she left, and she did not shut the window." Now Peg was in a panic. She moved fast to the living room window, and on the fire escape was a coloring book and crayons on the landing and glitter on the window ledge. Her mind was racing. How could Jenny open this window? Did Michael leave it open? Was someone in the house? Jenny could have fallen and died, and no one would have been here. Peg's fear went to rage. She quickly grabbed a throw off the sofa, wrapped Jenny in it, turned off the stove, and hustled her out the door. "What's wrong, Aunt Peg?" the girl asked as Peg, half running down the hall to the elevator. "Nothing. We're just going to eat at my house." Peg did not feel safe until she was standing in the lobby of the apartment building. She sat Jenny on a chair by the door. "Sit here for a minute, honey." Aunt Peg has to call someone. Peg grabbed her phone from her purse and speed-dialed Michael. This could go on no more, she thought, as the phone rang, and then when he did not answer, she looked up the number and then called the police. Tuesday, 8 a.m. Michael. The small cemetery sat on a hill of a park. Michael had come there this morning early and sat with his beloved Morgan. He knew that he should not be leaving Jenny alone, but his heart nor his head would let him sleep without her. He had been drawn here to her every day since they placed her in this cold ground. On this cold October morning he had woken up from a dream of him and Morgan, crying with such force that he was sure that he would wake up his little girl. His grief was unyielding. It had grown worse with every day. It had become stronger with a cold indifference to the advice of everyone that had told him that time would heal all. So again, at 4:44 a.m., he had dressed in the dark and stepped quietly out of the apartment and made the walk here to be with Morgan. He knew that it was wrong. He knew that this was close to being sick. He knew that if he did not get a hold of himself soon, he might slip away. He sat there as the muted morning sun rose, offering little warmth, just staring at her gravestone, running his hand over the carved name and the inscription below it. Loving wife and mother, and Morgan's favorite quote, "With love's eyes, how beautiful the world can look." He wept, the words cutting through him like the cold wind. He could not even imagine how to begin to let Morgan go. He was so afraid of this loneliness, so afraid of death, hers, his, anyone's death. His mind filled with the visions of Morgan. "What I wouldn't give to hold you once more," he softly spoke to the small granite stone. Then, as always, the rage came. Morgan had been sick a year and had told no one. She had decided to die and had not even considered asking him or Jenny what they had wanted. She had simply got up every day and went about the business of living, hiding her pain, working on what seemed to Michael as meaningless tasks, while keeping a secret so devastating to all of them, spending every free minute at her gallery working on a show she would never be able to see, showing no one what she was working on, hiding even that from him and the people that loved her. And then, without any warning, in the small hours of the night, on a Tuesday in late June, she passed away in their bed next to him, leaving him alone. Angry, confused, and heartbroken, Michael raged at her doctors and sister and anyone he could find, demanding to know why none of them had told him, why none of them thought towards the shock that her sudden passing would bring, questioning what could have been done, what treatment she had refused, and over all of that, why she had made this choice. It did not matter to him when her doctor told him that there was nothing that could have been done. He was not convinced by the doctor when he had told Michael that he had never imagined that Morgan would be able to hide her pain all the way to the end. Peg had not known either, but Michael was still not convinced. He felt that Peg helping them was just Peg's guilt for not telling Morgan's secret. In short, Michael had struck out at everyone and everything. He felt as if every emotion he could feel were so close to the surface that the wind could cause him pain. In the sane part of Michael's head, he knew he was burning his world down. He watched it like he was outside his body, unable or unwilling to stop the man he saw from destroying his life. He was blinded by grief, and he knew it. What to do about it? He was at a loss. On top of all of this, he was 10 days away from having to attend the opening of Morgan's show, something that he had never even wanted to see. The time she had spent away from him and Jenny in those last days cut at him like a knife. He was not even sure that Morgan had wanted anyone to see it. She had never left any instructions, no will, or even a goodbye note. Morgan's friends wanted to show her last work as a tribute to their friend, but for Michael, it would be just another funeral. It all felt impossible to him, these feelings of rage and guilt and loss. He felt like he would never be able to be the same person he had been again. His phone rang, bringing him back to the real world. It was Peg, and he knew he should answer it. But instead he was filled with an overwhelming panic and an urge to run home. By the time he was rounding the last corner to his building, the phone stopped ringing. I hope I'm not too late, he thought. But then he wondered, late for what? Tuesday, 8:30 a.m. Michael came to a dead stop at the sight of 3 police cars blocking the road in front of his apartment building. A wave of fear shot through him. Before he knew it, he was running. Once inside, he found the stairs and raced up them to the 5th floor and down the hall to the open door of his apartment. He ran through the door so quickly that 4 officers inside grabbed him and forced him to the floor before Peg could tell them who he was. In the following moments, Peg explained that there had been someone in the apartment. She conveniently left out the fact that Michael had left Jenny alone. After the police had left the building, Peg and Michael made their way into the back bedroom. This has got to stop, Michael, Peg started. Michael started to shake his head yes before she even finished. No, she said, you've got to hear me out. I love you and Jenny. I lost my best friend in the world, and I'm holding on here by a thin thread. She stopped, trying to control herself. There was someone in your home. We do not have a choice here. You and I have to go on, and we have to take care of Jenny. I'm sorry, he said, stopping her in mid-sentence. I've only been thinking of myself. When I saw those police cars, He could not finish. The tears were overwhelming him. Peg could see the hurt and sorrow in his eyes. She found it hard to breathe, and the tears started. Michael pulled her close and hugged her. I'm going to. No, we're going to get through this, he said softly in her ear as she wept. He hoped that she believed him. He hoped that he believed him. After a moment, Peg pulled away and tried to compose herself. Okay, I've got to get Jenny to school, and you've... Shit, he exclaimed. I'm going to be late, realizing the time. They both gave each other one last look of reassurance and then moved like people with a purpose. As Michael closed the door behind him and hurried down the hall to the elevator, he only had one thought. Why did Jenny think it was an angel? Tuesday, 8:45 a.m. George was moving slower than normal on this day. Getting old, he thought to himself as he left the 2nd Street soup kitchen, thankful for the full belly. His feet seemed to hit the pavement harder than before. He felt old and heavy, like the weight of his years were pulling him down. Like so many others that lived on the streets of New York, George had long since given up any pretense about his situation. He was what every asshole called him. Homeless. It had been many years now, but George had given up getting mad at them, lashing out at them, or in general even caring what they or anyone thought of him. It was liberating in a way, if George took a moment to think about it, which most days he did not even do that. He had friends on the street, places that would let him do a little cleanup for some food, and on those really cold nights, many of the local churches opened up their doors for him and the others. He had seen more than his share of strange and wonderful things. People that would give you their last dime to those who would kick you as they walked by you. For the most part, George still had faith in humanity, children most of all. He could see in their eyes the empathy that was missing in most adults these days. They did not judge him the way adults did. They had no preconceived notions about him being a drunk or a drug user or someone that had just given up on life. And more often than not, people with children seemed to give more. He had seen friends frozen to death and strangers bring blankets and gloves out on a cold night. He had seen benevolent acts and incredible indifference that had brought him to a place in his mind where he thought he had seen it all. That was until she fell. Not from a step or tripping on a crack in the concrete, but from the sky. She had fallen right in front of him from so high up that her body made a thud sound, and George thought she surely must be dead. He stood there frozen for a long time, staring at her, waiting for the telltale signs of blood that he had seen before from a jumper. But nothing came. And then something happened that George had never seen before. The girl sat up, dazed at first, shaking her head in disbelief. She looked over at him with a small grin. Her eyes were unlike anything George could ever remember seeing before. She held up her hands in a "what are you gonna do" sort of gesture, and then she spoke right to him. "New wings," she said, mocking herself in a sweet and melodic tone that filled George with a sense of calm and awe. He began to laugh uncontrollably while tears rolled down his weathered face. "Well, George," she said, "are you going to just stand there, or are you going to help a girl out?" He rushed to her side, and when he touched her, it was like a bolt of lightning raced through him. "Between these wings and these tall buildings, I'm surprised that this had not happened sooner," she offered, as George pulled her to her feet. His head was spinning. He could barely think. "Are you a—" he started, as she turned to him and hugged him for the help. "You know what I am, George," she whispered in his ear, her warm breath heating his body. He felt so alive, like he was a teenager again. She pulled back from him and smiled. "I'm glad you were here to help me," she said as she stepped back and spun around, as if she was testing her body to make sure that everything worked. George just stared at her. Above them, the bell in the church tower rang. The girl jumped and then let out a laugh. "Wow, what does that mean?" she asked him. "It's the bell. It's 9 o'clock, he replied. "Oh, well, in that case, we better get going. I've got things to do." George took her outstretched hand, and they started to walk down the street together. He could not keep his eyes off her. At last he spoke to her. You look so much like my little girl," he said with a tear in his eye. "Emily was such a pretty girl. Thank you, George," she replied. Then asked him, "Do you know which way it is to City Hall?" George pointed, and they started to walk again, and suddenly the day seemed warmer to him. He was so taken by it all. That her knowing the name of his long-dead daughter was not even shocking. It did not seem to matter at all to him. He felt as light as air. Tuesday, 9:30 a.m. Michael. The cab pulled up to the tall stone building of City Hall, to a crowd of people. This was not too uncommon of a sight these days. As the assistant to the mayor, Michael had stood at these steps before in front of crowds like this. In his head, Michael tried to think of a reason for the crowd today, but he could not come up with any hot topic that might have spawned a protest. However, in the state he had been in, he was sure that he might have missed a thing or two. He got out and made his way through the crowd towards the bottom of the steps, and that was when he saw her, just standing there next to a homeless man. An angel. People were crowded around her, touching her, she touching them. His mind went directly to what Jenny had said this morning, and he wanted to know if this was the person that had been in his home. As he stepped towards her, she turned and looked right at him. He stopped cold. She raised her hand and waved with a broad smile. "Michael," she said in a happy voice, "there you are," as if she had been waiting for him. She moved through the crowd towards him. People parted quickly, and in a way that he had never seen a crowd do before. In a second, she was standing right in front of him. He did not know what to do first. He had the urge to call over security guards and have her taken inside. He wanted to ask her about Jenny and his apartment. He felt like he should be mad. But he could do none of these things. All he could do was look at her. She smiled warmly at him. "Good morning, Michael," she started. "I've been looking for you." Behind Michael and just outside of the crowd on the steps, another crowd had formed. He could hear them. They were calling to her, saying things like, "Pull off those wings, baby," and "Show us how you fly." He was instantly brought back to reality. Others from inside the crowd had started to yell back at these hecklers, and Michael could feel the prelude of some kind of mob riot getting ready to break out between the two groups. In the distance, he could hear the police sirens. He had to do something quickly. "Wow," she said, "this is a lot of people." And Michael knew that she was right. "Lady, I gotta get you out of here," he heard himself saying. She seemed unaware of the danger that Michael sensed. "But I just got here," she said in her carefree tone. He just shook his head. He looked back towards the opening in the crowd and saw a few taxis sitting across the street. "Come on," he said to her, and as he turned to walk down the steps, she grabbed his hand. He pulled her out of the mess. As he hustled her towards the cabs, he could hear people talking, some saying that it was a sign from God, others saying that it was some PR stunt, and still others saying that she looked like someone that they had once known or lost. Once at the cab, Michael opened the door and pushed the girl in, her wings hitting his face and folding through the car door opening. He closed the door and ran around the other side of the cab and got in. The driver looked back at the two of them and started to laugh. "And just, where are we going today?" he asked in a standard New York tone. "Just drive," Michael said, feeling the need to get them away from the building and the mob of people moving towards the car. The girl looked at Michael with a slightly disapproving tone. "Michael," she said, almost scolding him, "don't be mean to Bill here. He's had a hard day already." The driver looked at her. We know each other, lady. I mean, I think I'd remember meeting you," he said in a sarcastic quip. She smiled at him and leaned forward and touched his arm. "Bill, after you drop us off," she said, "I want you to call your wife and say you're sorry." The driver's eyes welled up with tears. Michael was confused and distracted by the people surrounding the cab. "Please, we've got to move now," was all he could say. The driver pulled the cab out from the crowd slowly. She turned and waved at them as they did. In a few blocks, Michael began to regain his composure. "Who are you?" he asked her. "I'm Jem," she replied. He studied her face. It was beautiful in a way he could not truly understand. She seemed so devoid of any type of pretense or the guarded air that most people had in the city. Childlike in a way, but not helpless by any means. He still needed answers, but in that moment he was unable to ask her anything. He was lost in a feeling that he had not had for a long time. Jem reached out and touched his shoulder. "Bill here needs to know where we're going," she said to Michael. He had no idea where to go. On the driver's radio, a Billie Holiday song came on. Jem smiled. "Turn this up, Bill. It's your favorite song." And it was. Just then, Michael's cell phone rang. He looked at the screen. It was the mayor's direct line. Michael answered it, and in a few moments, Michael was giving his marching orders. Tuesday, 10 a.m. The cab pulled into the underground parking lot on the backside of City Hall. No one was there, as the crowd and the chaos was still in full swing out front. Michael helped Jem out of the cab, and two women that worked for the mayor's office met them and covered her with a tablecloth to cover her wings. Within a few minutes, they were all sitting in the private conference room of the mayor's office on the top floor. Mayor Rand Deans and a few of his select staff were there. Outside the office, two policemen guarded the door. In the ride up the elevator, the two female staffers had gone from being cool and skeptical to looking at Jem as if they were in a trance. The mayor looked crazed and overwrought by the whole thing. "What the hell is going on here?" he asked Michael. "Is this some kind of stunt or what?" He finished in a hard tone. Michael did not know what to say. Jem looked at Michael and then at the mayor. "Now, Randall," Jem said, using his full first name, "hell has nothing to do with this, and I would appreciate it if you do not bring that up again." The mayor looked confused. He had wanted to get to the bottom of this nonsense, but now he felt small, like he had been caught with his hand in the cookie jar. "No one calls me Randall, young lady," was all he could get out. "Well, your mother did," Jem said with a warm smile. "I'm not here to cause a problem. I'm here to fix one, and I cannot tell you any more than that. Now, if you will excuse me, I'm going to go down to the steps and talk to the people." Jem stood up and walked towards the door, and then she turned to Michael. "Are you coming?" she asked him. He thought for a moment about not moving, but he found himself following her anyhow. "You two get back here!" The mayor tried to stop them, but he was unable to even stand. "Stop them!" he called out to the 2 police officers that were in the hall, but they would not move. They were too taken by her. Michael followed her to the elevator and got in. She just stood there. "You have to push the button," Michael said to her. Jem laughed. "Silly me. This is all so new to me." Michael leaned over and pushed the lobby button. "You know, they're gonna eat you alive down there. The press is rough. You can't even operate an elevator. You should reconsider this," he said, wanting desperately to avoid the mob in the street. As they rode the car down, Michael looked at her. She was captivating. He wondered if she had been the one in the apartment. "Yes," Jem said before he could ask. "Jenny is a sweet and wonderful girl. So full of life, and so sad. She needs you, Michael. You have to be there for her." Michael began to weep. This could not be happening. She was not what she seemed to be. It wasn't possible. He felt angry. He felt ashamed. He could not even look at her. He had never felt anything like this in his life. In his mind, he could hear his internal voice screaming, "This is not real." Jem turned to him as the elevator stopped, placing her hand on his shoulder. "I am real, Michael. As real as love." The doors opened, and he followed her into the front of the lobby. The doors of the building had been locked to keep the crowd out. Jem looked over at the guards, and they looked at Michael. Michael had a million questions racing to form a list in his mind. "What is it that you are doing to everyone?" he asked her. "Nothing. Only helping them to see with their hearts. You all are so lucky to have them. It pumps blood, it keeps you alive, and it allows you to feel the greatest thing there can ever be." "I do not understand." "I know, Michael. Now open the doors, please." "Open them up," Michael heard himself saying, and then to Jem, "I don't want you to get hurt. Please let me bring them out with us," he pointed to the guards. Jem smiled at him and reached her hand out, placing her palm on his chest. "You have a good heart, Michael. But you're not here to save me. I'm here to save you." As they stood there, his chest seemed to get warmer and warmer. He felt his heart welling over with a sense of love. In that moment, all of his pain was gone. All that remained was a perfect picture of Morgan as he remembered her on the beach that summer in Key West, the warm sun on their skin. Later, her face glowing with love as they made Jenny that night. He could feel her embrace, her arms around his neck. He was lost in it. "What are you doing to me?" he asked through his tears, wanting so much to fight it but unable to, asking himself why he would want to fight something so beautiful. The harder he tried, the more he remembered. Every wonderful thing that he and Morgan shared came flooding back to him in a way that mere memories seldom do, forcing back his hurt, replacing it with something stronger and more powerful than pain, until he gave in to it. He gave in to her. Michael felt the last month drain out of him, until nothing remained but joy. "What are you doing to me?" he asked again, spent and exhausted. Jem hugged him. "Reminding you of what it looks like." "What?" he asked again in confusion. "How beautiful your world can look, Michael, when you see it through the eyes of love." He stood there motionless, lost in a place he had never been before. All he could see was Morgan and Jenny and Peg, the people closest to him. He never wanted this feeling to end. As the doors opened, the crowd that had been in a frenzy at the sight of them standing there became silent as death, and Jem walked out and over to the podium. A man called out first from the crowd, "Are you an angel?" "Yes, I am, Jonathan." And then another yelled out, "Why are you here?" "To remind you that you are loved above all others." And then a woman walked out of the crowd and stood in front of Jem. She looked cold and hard, her face devoid of any emotion. She wore her pain and loss for all to see. "What if I do not believe in angels?" she yelled at Jem. Jem walked out from behind the podium and up to her. She took her hand. "That doesn't matter, Sarah. That doesn't matter, Sarah. The point is that we believe in you. That's all that matters." And then lastly, a voice from the back of the crowd. "Do you have a message for us?" Jem looked like she was thinking, her face twisted up like a child's face. She squinted one eye, her mouth turned up to one side, and then she smiled again. "Yes, I do. Yes, I do, Brandon. Always remember, you are not alone." Jem walked into the crowd. The people parted as she did. She grazed her hands on them. Each in turn felt something very different and just for them. At the bottom of the steps, Jem turned back and looked up at Michael one last time. George came up to her on the street. "Take me with you," George begged. Jem looked at him. "No, George. Keep me with you." In the distance, the clock struck noon, causing Jem to jump like before. "Gotta get going now," she said to George. And she spread her wings out, and in a few seconds she had disappeared into the gray winter sky. No one moved for some time. Like Michael, they were lost in their own moments of bliss. When they did at last start to move, they felt lighter and warmer, and for a while, they felt love. 10 days later, 7 p.m. Over the past week and a half, the story would travel around the world. Reports ran from a miracle to myth to madness and beyond. Evangelicals claimed that it was a sign from God, while others said it was aliens. For the 300 people that were witness, it was life-changing. They had told their story to anyone who would listen, how they felt better, more at ease with life, how all of them knew, now, that they were not alone. The comfort and sense of awe they felt was almost impossible to convey to someone who had not been there. For the skeptic, much was made about the fact that while there had been 33 members of the press on hand that day, none of them took a single picture or a second of video. Further investigation would show that all the security cameras were able to capture was fuzzy shots of the crowd and someone walking into the street. In short, there was no hard evidence that it had ever happened. As things often do, the story started to take a turn for the worse. The mayor had said he had witnessed nothing but a woman in a costume that caused trouble and had to be thrown out of the building. After all, it was an election year, and no one wanted to answer questions that surrounded the belief in angels. Michael wanted to argue with him, but his job was too good to put in jeopardy. He had his daughter to think about, and no matter what anyone said from one side or the other about the story, he knew something had happened, something that had changed him, and the fact that by the time the tribute to Morgan came around, mostly everyone had turned their backs on what they had seen or felt did not matter to him, and it never would. In all the madness that came after Jem left, he and Peg and Jenny had come together in a way that seemed impossible to imagine just 10 days ago. Now they stood as the crowd filled in to see the work that Morgan had done in those last days. The gallery owner had covered the canvases and had people stationed at each of them to begin the show in a manner that would reveal the paintings one by one. While Michael had been thinking that it would have been another wake, the stories and the feelings that surrounded him as her friends and admirers came to him one by one were of hope and affection. They were not there to mourn, but to celebrate her. He could hardly believe that he had not wanted this to happen. In all the stories that the witnesses had told, the ones that still rolled around in his mind were the ones where people had been reminded of someone they had lost. Some even said that she looked like those loved ones that had departed. He wondered why that had not been the case for him. Why Jem had not felt like Morgan to him. He would have wanted so much to see her one more time, to feel her presence. He was grateful for the gift that Jem had given him, the memories that she had brought back to him. He knew that he would never forget them now, and Jem had done that for him. It was still hard for him to want to be close to Morgan, and to know that he would not ever be again. The crowd gathered in the lobby of the gallery, and at 8 p.m. they announced the show would start. The paintings were aligned in what would best be described as a maze. Michael, Jenny, and Peg were the first to start. As they started to walk from one to another, Michael had noticed the paintings seemed darker than her work just a few years ago. Somewhere about midway through the line of paintings, they became lighter, more softer, ethereal with each one. The last set of paintings were titled Self-Portraits. Morgan was there in her workshop, and she was surrounded by angels, each touching her as she worked. Peg started to cry. Michael could not hold back the tears either, and it was Jenny that spotted it first. "Daddy, do you see her?" she said with excitement. And Michael did. There in the second to the last portrait was Jem. She was the closest to Morgan. It was unmistakable and unbelievable. And in that moment the words of her doctor came back to Michael. How he had said that she could not have hidden her pain from anyone in those last days. Now Michael understood that she was not alone in her last days. He had felt Jem's touch. He knew now that Morgan had felt no pain. The last painting was of Jenny, Peg, and Michael, standing together on the top of the hill, overlooking the city. Above them was a bright and warm sun, and behind them was Morgan, floating slightly off the ground, her hands reaching outward towards them all. On the ground next to them was a simple stone with the phrase that Morgan loved so much. "With love's eyes, how beautiful the world can look." It was so clear now to Michael what Morgan had done and why. She left them something that they would always have, something that could hold them together and give them hope. He had been so mad about the time he lost with her, but now he knew that her work was not for her. It had been for them, all of it for them. "Mommy is our angel," Jenny said. And the last thing that Jem had told the crowd came back to Michael. "That's right, honey," Michael said, holding her hand so tightly. "Always remember, you are not alone." You've been listening to Wings by Richard Hendry, copyright 2018, narrated by Richard Hendry.